This show is sponsored in part by St. Germain Catering, a woman-owned business that is professional in every delicious detail. And the Ruddy Law Firm in Fairfax City, Virginia, a law firm that provides legal services in the fields of probate, estate administration, and elder law. Welcome to the Probate Nation. My name is Richard Ruddy, and I will be your host this evening. In earlier shows, we have discussed the probate journey that many will need to embark on in order to transfer the asset of a loved one who has passed away. Typically, that journey only begins after you have given your loved one a funeral and burial consistent with their wishes. And I can relate this to a recent personal experience. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were returning home on a Saturday evening and noticed some members of our church out front of the home of an elderly widow from our church with whom we were friends. We stopped to see if there was a problem, and as events unfolded, we eventually found her passed away alone in her bed. Phone calls were made, and police, fire department, priest, and funeral home all appeared in due course, and in the days thereafter she was given a beautiful funeral and she was properly buried. As I thought about that evening, it occurred to me that most folks really do not know how all these moving parts work in such harmony. So what we will be discussing over the course of 3 shows are some of the practical challenges and steps many must address when a loved one passes away at home, with who do you call to report the death and what unfolds with that phone call. Some of the common questions and concerns families face in arranging a funeral and burying a loved one, and in particular the costs associated in doing so. And finally, in a salute to our military, we will discuss bereavement support resources and burial options available to our military across the country, and particularly in Northern Virginia. Our show today begins with the challenges many families face when a loved one dies at home. Again, who do you call? What happens when that call is made? What should you do after the call is made? And these and other related questions will be discussed with our guests, so let's get started. With us today is Fairfax County Police Patrol Officer working out of the Sully District Station. She has been with Fairfax County Police for 9 years, initially as a patrol officer, and then as a public information officer, and then returned to parole duty in 2012. She has responded to dozens of calls to check on the welfare of friends, family, and loved ones, and in particular calls for reported deaths. Also joining us today is the General Manager of Fairfax Memorial Funeral Home in Fairfax, Virginia. He has been a funeral director for over 25 years, and during that time has acquired valuable experience in addressing the varying needs of families with diverse cultural and religious backgrounds. He currently serves on the Board of Directors for the Cremation Association of Northern America. Please join me in welcoming Fairfax County Police Officer Tawny Wright and Fairfax Memorial Funeral General Manager Archer Harmon. Thank you for joining our show today.
Thank you.
Nothing is more devastating to a family than the death of a loved one, but in particular when a loved one passes away at home, regardless of whether it was expected or not. Archer, tell me what are the typical kind of situations that arise where you find people have passed away?
The first one is a home death where the patient is under hospice care, and then the second one is an unattended death, meaning that the person died and was not under the care of a doctor or a hospice care provider.
Okay. Officer Wright, if a family member believes someone has died at home, who should they call?
If they believe it's a medical emergency or there are any signs of life, they should call 911 immediately. If it's obvious that their person has passed, they can go ahead and call the non-emergency number.
Very good. And what happens when that call is made?
Both the police and fire departments respond to investigate a death or medical emergency.
Okay. Archer, let's discuss the first situation where someone passes away at home, where they die under the care of hospice. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about that.
Hospice is introduced to the patient through the involvement of medical providers when the person is not expected to recover. Hospice comes to the house and provides palliative care for the individual until the person dies or passes away at home.
So when a hospice patient passes away, what should the family do?
Okay. The first thing that the family should do is call their on-call hospice care provider and let them know that the death has occurred. The hospice nurse will come out and do the official pronouncement at the residence, which is required.
So in preparation for hospice to come to the house when that phone call is made, what are some of the things the family should be prepared, if they can, to provide to them when they arrive?
If the family has selected a funeral home, have that information for the hospice care provider, because they will contact the funeral home. And the information that we need from the hospice care provider is the name of the deceased, the location of the deceased, the time of death, which again is required for a death certificate, and also the date of death as well. And then also doctor's information, so we can contact the doctor, and also any relevant information that we need to know, where the location of the deceased is in the house. Is the person a large person? Anything that we need to know, we'll ask the hospice care provider.
Okay. So the other type of death at home is called an unattended home death, which is the one that I described at the outset of the program that I experienced. Tell me what that involves.
An unattended death is a death where the person was not under hospice care, or did not have a doctor, or the death was not expected.
Okay. So Officer Wright, if the deceased person is under the care of hospice or not, do they still make that phone call to get everybody involved?
If a person is under 24-hour hospice care or 24-hour nursing care, they do not need to call the police. The hospice staff will take care of everything.
Very good. Okay. So you mentioned the fire department comes out to the scene. Tell me, what is the fire department going to do, and what's their purpose for responding to the call?
The fire department, if there's any indication that there's life, they will immediately take life-saving measures. There are cases where they will transport a person to the hospital if they are still alive. If there's a possibility of the person dying, an officer will follow the ambulance to the hospital to stand by to find out what's going to happen, and officers will remain at the home. If the person is obviously deceased, the fire department may assist the police department to check for trauma, but then they will leave and police will continue their investigation.
Very good. And then what is the role of the police department then in responding to a call? Again, a non-hospice call.
The police have two roles. One is to investigate all deaths, and then the second role we have is to provide support and family to get them through their tough time.
Okay. So you mentioned that one of the roles of the police investigation is to determine whether or not there's foul play or trauma. What would be evidence that had occurred here?
Yeah, we look for obvious signs of trauma, a gaping wound, obvious forced trauma. I think in most instances that's not the case.
Okay. And so if there is that evidence of trauma or foul play, what do you do next?
Okay, so patrol officers respond to the initial death or welfare check report. If there are signs that it's a suspicious death, we contact our major crimes division, and detectives will come out and take over the investigation. They have more specialized training, and also our crime scene detectives may respond to process the scene.
So anybody who discovered the body would then stay on the scene and be interviewed and to gather information about the family.
Yes.
Okay. So if there's no suspicious circumstances surrounding the death, then what unfolds then as far as the police? What do they do?
Okay, what we do, like I said, once we determine there's no foul play, we assist the family in making funeral arrangements. We contact a doctor or physician to sign off on the death certificate. And from there, we just kind of provide support for the family. It's a very overwhelming time, and a lot of people, when the death first happens, aren't sure what to do. So the police have kind of taken on a role in guiding them through this initial process.
Very good. So at some point, the body of the deceased needs to be transported either to the funeral home chosen by the family or to the medical examiner's office. So let's discuss for a few moments, what dictates where things happen. So, officer, if there is foul play or trauma, where will the body go from the scene of the death?
The body will be picked up and taken to the medical examiner's office for further investigation.
So that's part of their role as a medical examiner, is to examine those types of situations.
It is.
And so who makes the decision? And do the police then make the arrangements to have the body transported? So you're saying it's the responding homicide people who make that decision?
If there's anything suspicious about the death, our homicide detectives will respond. Then they said they take over, and they will have the body transported to the medical examiner's office for further investigation. If there's nothing unusual, they release it back to the family.
Okay. If they determine that there is no foul play, then what is the most important information the police are looking for at that point at the scene?
Yeah, part of our role, we're trying to get a brief history on the background about health issues, medical issues. We need we need the full information on who the person was, their name, date of birth, that kind of information. So that way we can help, locate a doctor to sign off on the death certificate. And then from there, like I said, we help the family funeral arrangements if they want it, or, we're just there for support.
So once the police have confirmed that the doctor will sign the death certificate, what is the next step at that point?
Our role from there is just to assist the family if they need it.
Okay. And so at that point you provide support, help them make arrangements with the funeral home. I know that you mentioned in the past that there are police chaplains available. Can you talk a little bit about how they help out?
Sure. Yeah, police chaplains are an invaluable resource to both the police and the community. Some families have priests or clergy that they see regularly, that they want to talk to. Other families don't. And in a time of crisis like that, we have many police chaplains who will come out and sit with the family, talk to them, and help guide them and comfort them. In addition to our services.
That's a valuable resource. So, Officer, what if the family or the police cannot get in contact with the patient's doctor to sign the death certificate? What do we do then?
Yeah, in the case where we can't find a doctor or a doctor will not sign off on the certificate, we contact the medical examiner's office to take over.
Okay. So, if no one can be located to sign the death certificate, what happens?
We have to find somebody. We can't leave until we get that taken care of. So like I said, most doctors have an on-call or paging service, to stand by, and we usually get a hold of them. Sometimes it takes time, but if we can't find somebody, we will contact the medical examiner's office for guidance.
And at that point in time, will the medical examiner's office then direct that the body be sent to them?
I believe so.
Is that correct? Okay. We've mentioned several times that the Office of the Virginia Medical Examiners has various roles in this particular process, and obviously their role is important when someone passes away at home for obvious reasons. To learn more about the medical examiner and for answers to questions that they most frequently get from the public, they prepared a pamphlet. The pamphlet and the website link where it can be found are posted on screen. Archer, once the police or hospice have authorized the release of the body to the funeral home, how soon after the family makes the call to the funeral home will they typically arrive at the house?
We're usually at the house within 45 minutes to an hour, again, depending on the circumstances and how far it is from our funeral home. But we will give the family our best estimate of the time that we will arrive.
Okay. And when the funeral home arrives at the home, how do they proceed to collect the body for transport? Okay.
We always send 2 staff members to the residence, and at that time, a lot of times the families will have a lot of answers or a lot of concerns. We will bring this pamphlet with us. It has a lot of information about the funeral home and what's needed for the arrangement conference to make the funeral arrangements. But the first thing that we want to do once we answer all the questions and just answer the basic questions, we want to see where the deceased is located, because if it's a home death, it can be in tight quarters, so we need to see exactly what we're dealing with before we actually bring our stretchers in. And our stretchers are very similar to what the EMTs use. The other thing is we have a special one that if it is a tight quarters, it's a hand-carried cot or a stretcher, but it's very important because, again, the person could be large in size. They could be between a piece of furniture or something like that when the death occurs. So.
And do you usually send 2 people out?
We send 2 people, yes.
And do the police officers help sometimes with the removal of the body?
We usually help direct them to where the person is. Sometimes they collapse in a bathroom, and so it's tight. So we do help periodically.
Very good, sure. So when the funeral home arrives, Archer, is there information that they need in order to proceed with their normal process?
Yes, and I had mentioned it again earlier that we bring the packet, and that information that we first we want to establish is what type of funeral services that they want. If it's an appropriate time to ask that question. If they're distraught, we don't ask those questions. We just really take care of the situation at that time. We try to set an appointment for the family to come in that afternoon or the next day, and then help them plan the funeral and secure what it is that they need to do to get the funeral started.
But the package of information that you mentioned earlier contains a questionnaire to help gather the information that is needed for that death certificate. So when they come to that initial conference, if they have that complete, they can move that process along.
Correct. And the information that we need, again, is the name, the proper legal name, Social Security, date of birth, all of that information. It's also in our packet. So when the people do come, they come prepared to make decisions, because again, death certificates are very important to people. So
when hospice is involved, do they often encourage folks and help them gather that information in advance?
They do, and hospice is very good about getting the families to come and speak with the funeral home before the death has actually occurred. And then when that happens, it's a much easier transition for them. There's a lot less emotion, I don't want to say emotion, but there's a lot less stress in the unknown at that point when people do make contact with the funeral home before the death has actually occurred.
Of course, of course. Once the body has been released to the funeral home, does the body go to the funeral home, or does it go to an intermediate place?
No, it comes directly to our funeral home, and when we come to the residence or wherever the death has occurred, we come in a small white van, very inconspicuous, and we don't want to draw attention to a situation that does not need attention drawn to it.
Of course. Officer, once the deceased has been removed from the home and the family no longer needs your assistance, what do the officers do at the scene next?
We document all death investigations. So what we do is we leave our card, a business card with the case number on it, in case they need to reference it for any reason. And we just make sure that they have everything they need to get through this time, and we go on our way.
Very good. And Archer, once you have taken possession of the body and undertaken to move it to your care facility, what's the next step then the family should do?
At that point, again, make an appointment with us, or we'll confirm an appointment to sit down and go over the details and discuss their options of what they want. They may want a traditional burial, they may want cremation, it may be a burial at Arlington National Cemetery, and we will help them with anything that needs to be done with that process.
Very good. And at the arrangement conference, in addition to the funeral and burial arrangements, remind me again, what is the important task to be accomplished when we come, besides just making those arrangements?
The important thing at that point is to know, the family needs to know that the person's secure at the funeral home, and also we help them sort through 60 decisions that are made within a 2 or 3 hour period of time, and we help them sort through that as best we can and give them as much guidance as we possibly can.
So at that time also, we're also making sure we have all the complete information in order to get the death certificate prepared.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Because death certificate's important, because you're an estate attorney, and you know as well as I do that with a death certificate, you have to have a certified death certificate to have access to bank accounts, wills, etc. So that's why the death certificate is so important.
So let's take a moment and talk about the death certificate. So what goes on the certificate and the information that the family needs to gather. Now we talked about a little bit earlier, but can you kind of go over that again?
Absolutely.
It's very important, because that is one of the most important documents that they need to get quickly.
Right. The death certificate, the first thing is the person's full name, because they may call him Bob, but again, we need the proper legal name is how it's going to appear on tax statements, bank accounts, things like that. Social Security number, date of birth, the parents' names, the deceased parents' names, including the mother's maiden name. All that information is placed on a death certificate. Also, another one that's very important is, was the person in the armed forces? And if they were in the armed forces, then we need to get a copy of their discharge paper. It's a DD-214. But also there's a space on the death certificate that asks if they are a veteran. And all of this information is needed to process the death certificate. And then the one thing that I've almost forgotten is the highest level of education that's important on the death certificate as well.
Okay. Okay. So once you have all that information gathered, you know, in order to prepare the death certificate, what happens next?
After we prepare the death certificate and the family proofreads it for us to make sure everything is accurate, we then physically take it to the doctor and get it signed. And once it's signed, then we have it authenticated in the county or the city where the death occurred. And once that is done, then we can get the certified death certificates, which become legal documents at that point, so people can proceed with probate, bank account transfers, et cetera, whatever you need a death or whatever you would need death certificates for to finalize the business.
So from the time that they've gotten all the information to you at the arrangement conference, how long does it take to actually get the death certificate?
On average, we can have certified death certificates for family members probably in 7 to 10 business days. And that's provided that the doctor's available to sign the death certificate. As Officer Wright had suggested, sometimes they're difficult to get in contact with.
They are indeed. Officer, you know, in your years on the police force, you know, helping families deal with the grief that follows a sudden death of a loved one, what are some of the challenges you most often encounter when you arrive at the home of a reported death? And do you have any suggestions as to how folks could plan for that in advance in order to make that situation a little less emotional or stressful?
Yeah, many times, you know, obviously death of a loved one is a very, very emotional event. Family members are often distraught. Their minds are distracted because they're trying to process all the emotion and everything that's going on. So it can be very difficult for us to get technical and specific information about, you know, the full name and background. It's helpful to have a list of prescriptions that they're taking, a list of serious health issues, to have the doctor's name on hand or the most recent doctor after hours numbers. If you're anticipating that a death may occur, you can line all those things up, which makes it easier for the police to get the information we need, and then we can assist you.
Very good. And Archer, given your many years of experience in the funeral home business, being well aware of the many challenges and emotions that family face, when someone dies, what advice do you have for folks as to how they could take care of some of these things in advance in order to avoid some of the problems that we've discussed today?
It amazes me that couples have been married 50, 60 years and they've never had the discussion of what was going to happen when one of them dies. And if it's brought up, the person says, oh, I don't want to talk about this. But the problem that causes is when someone does die, the spouse or whoever is left to make these arrangements, and they're guessing at this point of what this individual wanted. Did they want to be buried? Did they want to be cremated? They were a veteran? Do they want to go to a national cemetery? And so it's difficult enough that they've lost somebody, and now all of a sudden there's this guessing game that, what did this person want? And again, it's just a simple conversation. I want to be cremated, I want to be buried, I want to be buried in a national cemetery, or whatever the case may be. It's just a simple conversation. And the other thing that people can do is they can come to the funeral home and prearrange their funeral ahead of time. And it's essentially a list of the things that you want done, things said, and it takes a lot of the burden off of the family when the death occurs. They can concentrate on the more important things as far as getting family members in from out of town and clergy and all of that, as opposed to going through the mechanical process of, guessing what, did they want to be buried, cremated, etc. So it's just having conversation. Death is inevitable for everybody, and it just needs to be discussed.
That is so true. Mm-hmm. That's so true. I want to thank our guest, Fairfax County Police Officer Tawny Wright in the Fairfax County Police Department, and Archer Harmon, General Manager of the Fairfax Memorial Funeral Home, for taking the time to talk with us today. This is a difficult and emotional topic to discuss, and certainly more so in the midst of an unexpected death of a loved one at home. The professionalism coupled with sympathy and compassion that you folks in the police and fire department, with the funeral home, and all those who are involved when this sad event occurs is a source of great comfort to the families facing immediate decisions in the midst of their obvious grief. God bless you, and thank you for your service to our community. Okay. This brings us to the conclusion of our show today on what to do when someone dies at home. We hope you will find the information provided helpful. However, while your loved ones have arrived at the funeral home, this is not the end of our conversation on this topic. Now you need to make a host of very personal decisions, from casket selection, cremation, funeral arrangements, and then burial, all typically without any guidance from the loved one who has passed away. In an upcoming show, we will address the common questions and concerns families face and choices they have to make in making these decisions. On behalf of myself and the entire Probate Nation, thank you for visiting with us